Once was a swagman camped by a billabong under the shade of a coolabah tree. As he sat, as he watched and waited while his billy boiled, "Oh, come a waltzing Matilda with me." Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is Arnie Lukes here at the Crossroads, and I'd like to welcome our forum members. Betty Lukes from Adelaide. Welcome, Betty.
Annie, thank you and good morning.
And Wallace Klinck from Canada. Welcome, Wallace.
No, good to see you again. It's a beautiful day here in Western Canada.
Good on you. Good on you, Western Canada. Wally said the other day it was interesting. They had a chill overnight, a bit of a blow, and it got to something like -29 or something like that. And it's whoa. Uh, we get hang on. I'll just cut across to you. I'll just cut across to you, Wally. There you go. So you're live. What were you saying?
Oh, I was just saying it's going to be going up around 30 above during this coming week.
Okay,
So it'll be
beautiful,
fairly warm. And
beautiful.
the flowers are coming out and the trees are blossoming and it's really getting to be quite nice.
Hmm. Isn't that lovely? Because in Adelaide, in South Australia, Southern Hemisphere, of course, we're going into autumn, into fall, and we've got some persimmon trees out the front. And anyone who's got a persimmon tree, the leaves go beautiful, a reddy orange, yellow, and they're an absolute sight. They're a wonder to the eye. They're just absolutely gorgeous, absolutely gorgeous. All right, so our forum today. We talked, the last two forums, major ones, have been about money creation, the fraud in money creation. And I wanted to actually bring an illustration up, and this is from a Waddell book. And the illustration shows the seals that were used for pecuniary, for pickers, for cattle, for coinage. And of course, these were leather or clay discs. And on that point, I'd hand it over to Betty to continue on with our theme. Betty Lukes.
Thank you, Annie. Yes, I just wanted to make the point that while C.H. Douglas explained how the owners of the wealth originally issued their own money tokens, but it was originally done in with a leather disc. The time came, and I think this was probably about 1,000 years later, in the Indus Valley civilization. Um, they use the clay discs, and that's what you see. That picture is of the owners of the wealth are saying, "This is the wealth that I have and represent, and one of my discs I've presented to the corn merchant, which he can bring here, and I will give him the cattle that is promised by that disc." I think it's important to remember, and we're looking at history now, and remember that the power passed from the owner of the wealth to the custodian of the wealth, and that was the goldsmiths and silversmiths, and to the Bank of England to issue the credit notes or the money tokens, whatever we're going to call them. And it was that the Bank of England actually monetized the real wealth of the nation. And at that stage in history, and we're looking at the origins of the Bank of England in 1694, at that stage, it it shows you that they monetized the real wealth of the nation. And the Bank of England was a private institution. Now you've got to bear that in mind when you are looking at the history of money creation and money. And I'm just going to add this little bit, but I'll finish there on this question, and that is that in the Social Creditor of 1969, they warned that what was happening is with the accelerating analytical approach to life and the method of splitting experience up into bits and pieces and acting as though each bit was the whole is what we're seeing all around us. And that to me is something that Ian McGilchrist in his book, The Master and the Emissaries, deals with very well and will help us in future sessions.
Thank you for that, Betty. That's an excellent opening salvo. Um, that money itself was originally issued in the form of a promise to pay from the producer. A promise to pay from the producer. I produce cattle, or I produce this, or I produce that, and so the producer was able to issue their money, whether it be in leather discs or in clay, and that was transposed, and in the form of transposing, it was turned into a fraud. And that was where the Bank of England, a private institution, not a public institution, but a privately owned institution, took over the issuing of money in the form of printed coin, and then, of course, as we see today, in the form of computer blips on a computer. And that is how the entire productive capacity of the community is monetized, and then of course the central banks claim it as their own and demand interest. And of course, when we look at the debt clock, we realise that is the method of confiscation that they have been using for hundreds and hundreds of years. It's a fraud, and it's continuing even to this day. Wally Klinck.
Yes, well, there's no doubt about it that money is a complex subject. It goes way back to Mesopotamian times and even earlier. Even accountancy goes back apparently to Mesopotamian times. And but for the modern world, accountancy was actually developed by an Italian called Pacioli about 1500, the year 1500, and it's a double entry system. And the evolution of money went, as you say, from tokens and so on to a situation where credit was issued by the custodians of gold. And what the custodians did in issuing money was to actually secure for themselves the ability to monetize or to activate the real credit of society. Because the real credit of society is the ability to produce goods and services for people. And when the custodian gets the power to monetize and activate the real credit of society, obviously that places an enormous power in the custodian's hands. And really, it doesn't represent a free society operating in production and distribution and consumption, because the control of policy becomes centralized in that case, and it's only through the issue of the credit that these potentialities of the human association are actually allowed to happen. And so that the purpose of the policy of production and consumption of economic as a whole can be centrally controlled. And we in our modern world, with the central banks and our national banks and their control of the interest rates and the control of the ability of the banks to expand credit, live on a very centrally directed system. People do not really realize that. They do their work, they do their jobs, they produce, and they don't really think about where the ultimate policy is originating. I know that it has been said with regard to our system of accountancy that it's like a graphic delineation. It's a two-dimensional art that attempts to portray reality in a three-dimensional world. Now, it records two sets of reciprocal money values. The cost accountancy and cost accountancy records costs in terms of money value with human value left out. And so within the limits of accountancy, the accountant is not capable of really defining the meaning of money. They're just dealing, as you have mentioned, with figures, Betty. And so they're not thinking about the actual significance of money from the standpoint of society and its benefits, well-being as a whole. If you ask an accountant to deal with certain questions, he can't define money because that's not his business. He's just dealing with figures. And similarly, the economist is unable to properly define money too. In other words, there's a third factor that has to be entered, and that factor relates to the unearned increment of association. It refers to a factor that represents wealth that goes beyond mere exchange. And there has to be a mechanism for distributing that wealth in society, which we do not have today, except by debt. And debt doesn't really, it distributes the product in as much as this is permitted, but it does not liquidate the costs of that production, which, in other words, money, one of the functions of money is to initiate production and to liquidate the costs of that production. And today, the costs are not properly liquidated. They are just simply carried on as a permanent growing mortgage weighing upon society. That is a debt that actually represents our inheritance and should have been entered as that third factor in accountancy and finance to distribute fully the product of industry in each given cycle of production.
Excellent, thank you, Wally. That's beautifully put. I've never actually heard anyone say anything like that before. That there's actually a Trinitarian relationship to the financial system that needs to be taken into account, and the increment of association, of course, brings us to our inheritance, our cultural heritage. Back to Betty.
Well, Arnie, my thoughts have gone to the royal wedding that has just taken place of Prince Harry and Meghan, and I followed that, and I thought it was beautiful, but I also looked at it deeper, and I saw that there were all the ingredients were portrayed in that wedding ceremony and afterwards through that we see in modern society. And I just want to list a few of them. And one of them, of course, is the broken marriages. And think again about the way that history has been broken up into bits and pieces, and so society has been broken up into bits and pieces. Broken marriages and the results of that for the children, the next generation, the modernity, the feminism, and I must say I had a little giggle. I watched until Meghan and Harry drove off in this very modern car, and guess who was driving? It wasn't the man, it was the woman. I thought she's showing her feminism. And then again I looked at the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh, and they represented to me at a personal level the importance of the loyalty and understanding and stickability that is so important in a marriage. And of course, a wonderful example of the service that they give to their people. There, of course, was the racial mix that was quite pronounced in all of the service. And I have to say how I was so delighted with the cellist. He was a Negro chap from Northern England who played the cellist so beautifully. And then the American bishop who spoke on love. Now, to me, it was the New Testament concept of love, and the importance of the service to love one another, and that includes even people from another race. I've always had the understanding that you look at the individual and you deal with the personal relationship at that level, because we're all creatures of God. But I was very pleased the way that the American bishop really stirred up, I'd say, the complacent bishops of the Church of England, and he did a good job. And so I'd say that there are all the ingredients of a modern society in that relationship. And so I just wonder if we have thought about what that young couple did their best to portray in that service. And can I continue?
Yeah.
Okay. I thought about the Queen's constitutional power. It is limited. She can only warn and advise, and there's another thing she can do, but she can't bring in legislation. So whatever the problems, the political problems in the world or in the countries, don't blame the Queen. She is limited, and but you, as an individual voter, you have the power to choose or refuse the politician that you're going to elect. There was charity. Of course, there was a great emphasis on the different charitable organizations. And, and of course, I see that the Queen has obviously fostered that concept in her son and her grandsons because they're very involved with charity. Well, if you go back to the original meaning of the word charity, it comes from caritas, the Latin caritas, and you're referring again to love. And then the politicians and their policies. Well, as I say, don't blame the Queen for the different policies because she doesn't make the policies. It is the politicians who make the policies, and it's you, the people, who have to put up with them. But the difference is that she has to work amongst her people. As I see it, she does her best amongst her people to bring in peace and harmony. And after all, we were told that blessed are the peacemakers. And through their work in the charities, the young people are showing, I think, the oldies another way, a friend and helper to those in need, and being true to one another. Of course, um, charity has now become a big thing because Wally will explain how he sees that. And I think at this stage it might be worth Wally explaining it.
Thank you for driving the floor, Betty. I'm enjoying that. Wally, you've got it.
Well, there's no doubt that the Queen is limited in her ability. She cannot make laws. She cannot pass laws. She cannot decree laws. But she can be the ministers of the crown can consult with her on policy. And they, of course, then from then on, they can bring it into the democratic or the representative area where they actually take it to the parliament and pass laws. So I think the Queen does have a function where she is able to have an input into policy. She can't dictate it, but I think she can advise. And I'm afraid that if she became too knowledgeable or too militant about advising, she might perhaps be dethroned because the real power of this world is the financial power. The City of London and its appendages. And and charity, yes, charity is an expression of love. It's one of the highest possible characteristics of the human personality, I'm sure. The only thing is, under the present system, charity is extended to many people who would not have to have it extended if we had an honest and a proper financial system which distributed their rightful inheritance to them in the form of genuine economic independence. And so the problem with charity is, in a sense, although it's done with the highest of motives, in most senses, although some charities have been subverted, it's a problem wherein the financial system creates an increasing deficiency of purchasing power and all the problems that stem from that, all the social and economic problems, so that the charities are incapable of dealing with the situation effectively in the long term. In fact, they can only fall behind because the financial system puts us all in an increasingly disadvantaged position. So although I am loath to criticize people for being charitable, I wish that they would become aware of what is creating the need for their charity so that they might take a constructive role in pressing for appropriate financial changes which would actually put them out of a job. Yeah. if possible.
Good work, Wally.
You see the problem?
That's excellent. Hang on, I've cut across you, Wally, so I've lost your audio. Um, okay, I'll come back to you just to close that out. Thank you. You're on, Wally.
Well, I was just saying that the charities, in a way, take the pressure off the existing financial system. They take the focus away from the financial system as the cause of our problems, and they redistribute the inadequacy that we all have in order that we can live. Because if there wasn't something to take the pressure out of the enormous inequities that would occur without charity, it would be a totally chaotic situation. You're going to have revolution and rebellion, and you're going to have a very, very a terrible situation developing. So in a way, the charities actually contribute to the continued dominance and dictatorship of the financial system. But I'm loath to criticize anyone who wants to be charitable, obviously.
Hmm. No worries. Thank you for that, Wally. That's that's a very interesting point. That while the charities are doing good works, and they are doing good works, they're not actually getting to the core of the problem. And if they were to pursue the problem to its core, then they would be standing alongside what we're doing here with this forum, is exposing the fraud of the money system, and attempting to present possible answers, alternatives, a method of distribution, so that the world debt clock would not continue to climb, but would stop and then would start to reverse, so that the debts would actually be cleared, and then people, as they produced things, would have sufficient purchasing power to actually buy them. Produce and buy. And that's the equilibrium that the financial system should reflect and could reflect. Betty Lukes.
Yes, of course. As I spoke before, what's happened to history is that it has been broken up into bits and pieces, and so we don't see the whole picture. We don't see the whole picture when it comes to what Christianity teaches. And as Wally mentioned, there's production, distribution, and consumption, and that consumption is left out of the equation. In fact, I I was most interested in the chapel, I think they call it chapel, where the wedding was held. And of course, you have 1,000 years of tradition there. Imagine that, ladies and gentlemen, 1,000 years. Australia is what, 200 years old? 1,000 years, and of course, the craft work is magnificent. The woodwork, the carvings, all of it is magnificent. But that took 1,000 years to develop. That didn't happen overnight. And neither did the money system happen overnight. And that's an area where we do have to look at. And of course, when, when I thought of the fact that we have 1,000 years of heritage there, well, wait a minute. Let's just put that word a little bit differently. What about inheritance? Inheritance. This country, compared with Europe and England, this country is very young. But the people have built and developed all that is that you can see today through their sheer hard work. And what are they inheriting from that? Well, with the money system, what it's doing, the fraudulent money system, they're losing it. And this is something we have to look at, the inheritance. And the social credit answer is that inheritance belongs to all the native born of this land, because it didn't happen overnight. It took hundreds of years to develop. And anyone who lives today can't say that they produced what we see around us. It was our forebears who did. And what are we inheriting? I can't see that we are inheriting anything at all. In fact, I see our politicians selling it off to the highest bidder. What for? Because they want money. Now,
That's actually an excellent point, Betty. And that is that we've had in Australia 200 years of expansion, of infrastructure development, of significant community projects. Not only, I mean, park aside the fact that we actually lost 100,000 able-bodied men in 2 world wars. Park that aside and don't look at it, and just because it's that in itself is an absolute huge personal cost, spiritual cost to Australia, and the actual what would you call it? The execution of the war with all the military machinery that went with it. Park that aside and say, well, okay, we won't look at that, but look at Australia itself, of roads, of railways, of bridges, of power lines, of power generation, of farming land, um, of industry. These things are have been built up over several hundred years, and there it was absolutely huge. And I would say that say in the last 40 years, I've watched us lose our industry in Australia. I've seen us lose our shipyards. Our shipyards were shut down. They were perfectly good shipyards. They were right next to the steelworks, which was right next to the coal. So that there was actually everything was in close proximity to each other, and it was efficient. You can't get more efficient than actually generating power right next door to the source of the iron ore in order to produce the steel, in order to make the ships. You can't get it more efficient than that. And then you turn around and you say, oh yes, but in Korea they can do this or do that, and perhaps with slave labour they can. But with modern technology, this is even doing away with slave labour. And so we could do these things. And here we are, we've handed it over, we've actually shut it down, and then at the same time we hand over vast tracts of our resources, of our national parks, of our ports, of our power generation, snowy mountains, hydroelectric. I mean, it's being handed over to these debt merchants. This is all the infrastructure. This is our inheritance. It belongs to Australia. It belongs to the people of Australia. And it's being handed over. And that's how big the fraud is. It's huge. Whole countries. Look at Greece. Don't think Australia is alone on this. Look at Greece. Everything is gone. The people are bankrupt. The government is bankrupt. Who to? The debt merchants through the fraud. Wally Klinck.
Yes, the frightening thing about it is that this wealth that we have arrived, all this infrastructure and so on, we get to use it, but unfortunately we don't really own it because there's an outstanding debt, which is a claim against it. And if the financial powers literally exercised their right of foreclosure, we would find out very quickly that we don't actually own what we are using. The fact that that a debt is created against this creates a constant movement toward the center of wealth, because of course all these debts have interest accruing on them and so on. People say, oh well, we just owe it to ourselves, but we don't owe it to ourselves. We owe it to a very, very few, small group of people, and it's not dispersed. It is concentrated, which is the wrong sort of approach. It's in medical terms, you can call it malignant, because it starves the outer limbs, it starves the outer cells, and that is a very, very dangerous, unhealthy situation. It's and again, you know, this question of if you grow a crop and at the end of the season it matures and it's ready for consumption, and someone comes along and congratulates you on your accomplishment, but tells you that you can't eat that, the results of that crop. You can't eat that food until you produce another crop. What are you going to tell them? You're probably going to tell them to get lost, and get lost fast. But because we operate under a financial system which places, as you say, a veil, Arnie, over the whole of our operations of production and distribution and consumption, we don't really realize what's going on. We live in a very complex economy, and people don't understand the basically simple implications, but they're not easy to discern because of the complexity of the system. Basically, that debt is simply our inheritance that has been taken away from us, and it should have been realized in the form of a form of lower prices and a form of increased purchasing power to make us all very, very independently wealthy in terms of our needs and wants, within whatever we are capable, the limits of what we're capable actually of doing. And we'll have to, we'll choose to have more and more goods, more and more gadgets and so on. But at a certain point, you get tired of that and you don't need it. You're going to want more leisure. You're going to want more time to visit with each other, to study, to understand history, what we are, or where we came from, and all these questions that add to culture, that make life really meaningful. You have a society that's just working like mad on a treadmill. It doesn't represent a very high level of culture.
Thank you, Wally. That's beautifully put. That's beautifully put. We're getting close to the half hour, and I'm going to do one last lap. But I think it's most profound where we've gone with this discussion today, because our cultural inheritance has been fraudulently stolen from us, and it's been hidden and it's been obscured. And the fact is that given an opportunity of an equitable financial system, and it's interesting because that preacher on at the royal wedding, he spoke about love, and I know that in in the social credit circles that I've been involved in for these years, the law of love is the foundation of what we're talking about, and the law of love, reflected in an equitable financial system, has an opportunity to release us and remove the enslavement, and that's to me is most profound. Okay, close. One last slap. Final comments, Betty.
Well, I'd just like to quote William Blake, who wrote, "To see a world in a grain of sand, and a heaven in a wildflower, hold infinity in the palm of your hand, and eternity in an hour." Now, modern man, that might be rather difficult, but if I point out that what he's saying is this, the point is clear. Everything is bound to all else. Causes are linked to effects, and we must be mindful of a diversity that underlies the apparent diversity of the world.
Thank you, Betty. Beautiful final comments, Wally. Final comments, please.
Well, our inheritance actually should be in a beneficial ownership of the communal capital and not an actual ownership. We don't want to have a government administered or owned productive system, because that does not work. It centralizes decision making and paralyzes individual initiative. And so that's a very undesirable thing. And it's been proved to be undesirable by the experience in the Soviet Union and other places where it's been allegedly tried. So we have that inheritance, and it should be in the form of a beneficial ownership, not an actual ownership. And that beneficial ownership should be expressed in lower prices, or realized in lower prices and increased purchasing power, so that we can always enjoy the full benefits of what we do in any given period of time.
Thank you, Wally. That's beautiful. I'm just going to direct our viewers to. I've brought up the wrong web page. Here it is. Direct our viewers to the ALOR library, and you'll find a wealth of information there from various writers on the history of social credit and the history of freedom and this law of love, and beautifully put a lot of times by Solzhenitsyn, as he shows, and we've got some very good work there by him, including a compilation. I know it's not an authorized compilation, but it is a compilation of his giant work, the 200 Years Together. And I've made it my business to go after any translation that I could for all the chapters. And so that composite there is of all the chapters of his book, translated either from the Russian to the English or from the French to the English. So I hope that you might avail yourself of that service that we've provided. Arnie looks at the crossroads. Once was a swagman camped by a billabong under the shade of a coolabah tree. As he sat, as he watched and waited while his billy boiled, who'll come a waltzing Matilda with me?